All right. This is the American YAWP, chapter 22, The New Era. So, this is a chapter that focuses on the decade of the 1920s. And there's a lot of different sections in this chapter that each touch upon a different theme. And it seems at first that many of these themes are not quite related to each other. It's kind of a decade where there's a lot of different things are going on. So, it's maybe a little bit difficult to keep track of. But there are some common similarities behind everything that we see in this decade. One thing to keep in mind is that this is post World War One, and it's easy to maybe overlook the impact that the war had on not just the United States, but really on people's attitudes and ideas. This was the deadliest conflict that had ever happened up until that point. And so a lot of people began questioning a lot of the assumptions and the sort of information that they had prior to that war. In some sense, after World War One, not really much made sense. And so people were kind of lost in this post World War One world. Another major trend is economic growth. And so, all during the backdrop of the 1920s, you have this growing prosperity, this growing consumption. So, kind of this, feeling of lost or confusion given the horrific conditions of the war, questioning maybe long-standing assumptions about, culture, society, or economics, combined with the economic and growth and prosperity of the 1920s. Again, we can kind of make connections between different themes, different events, different trends that don't seem like they have a lot in common, but do. And a perfect place to start is with politics of the 1920s, which is in fact probably not one of the more important aspects, I would say, of this decade. In 1920, the United States elected Warren Harding to the presidency. In 1920. And this was following Woodrow Wilson, who had served 8 terms. Woodrow Wilson, the progressive, Woodrow Wilson, the president involved in World War One. And what Harding ran on was a campaign of quote unquote return to normalcy. This was, you might say, appealing to US voters in 1920. And what, normalcy kind of meant was kind of back to the Gilded Age in some ways. And we can definitely point out some of the things that had transpired in the previous decade that many Americans had felt very uneasy with. So, one, I mean, World War One is kind of a good starting point for that, but then all of the other kind of things that came along with it. We might also include the progressive movement. The progressives did lead to a lot of change in society. Some of that change maybe was not completely wanted, and sort of issues stemming from World War One. So we talked last chapter about the Red Summer, racial violence across the country, the Red Scare, which was the fear of communism at home, given the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was the flu epidemic. And there was a series of domestic bombings that had taken place by presumed radicals. So, given all of this recent history, the fact that Americans wanted a quote unquote return to normalcy, that was enough to get Warren Harding elected into the office. And pretty much, if we want to consider the politics of the 1920s, the politics of the 1920s is defined by 1920s politics. It's three Republican, we'll say, quote unquote, hands off presidents. Again, harkening back in some ways to an earlier age where the government just wasn't nearly as involved, and a government that wasn't involved as much overseas as well, being a departure from imperialism and a departure from World War One. So Warren Harding was the first one of these presidents elected in 1920, promised Americans a return to normalcy. And for that reason, because many of these Republican presidents were somewhat hands off, there's not really a lot to say about them in terms of their accomplishments, because the whole point was to do less than what earlier presidents did. However, though, Warren Harding is also known as being one of the most corrupt presidents in American history. So we'll just make a note. One of the most corrupt. And the scandal that rocked the White House while Harding was in office was the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome scandal was when members of Harding's administration sold oil, say oil-rich lands, technically, for the U.S. Navy. These were, this was oil that was presumably for the United States Navy to private business. So instead of allocating resources for the sake of national defense, there were people in the Harding administration that were accused of selling this oil-rich land over to private businesses for profit. Now, the question was, to what degree was Harding involved? And during his presidency, Harding actually suffered a stroke and died in office. And it's believed that perhaps some of the tension or pressure and stress that he was feeling about this investigation into corruption in his administration is what contributed to his stroke. When Harding passed away, the presidency passed over to Calvin Coolidge, who is the second of these three Republican hands-off presidents. Calvin Coolidge, very much pro-business in his administration. In fact, the saying that is most closely associated with the Harding administration is the chief business of the American people is business, right? And so this was hearkening back to an earlier time period during the Gilded Age where, government was much more favorable towards business, as opposed to the progressive era, where in the progressive era, it was about regulating business, right? Kind of doing what's better for consumers, doing what's better for workers. Here, we're back to doing what is best for business. Very pro-business. They called him Silent Cal. He didn't really speak all that much. And again, because he was in the business of a hands-off presidency, not really a lot of accomplishments that we can say about the Coolidge presidency. However, though, one thing that is different in the 1920s, or does become different, are a new series of progressive amendments. And so these might look familiar, but just to remind us, the 19th and 18th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. And this occurred in 1920. So we might think about the politics of the 1920s, or of this particular decade. This was a decade, we'll say the 1920s is a decade where women are politically activated. So in terms of participating in terms of national elections, now because of the 19th Amendment in the 1920s, you see a lot more activity as far as women in politics in this decade. Another amendment is the 18th Amendment, and this is just showing you a little bit of the impact that more politically active women had on society. Again, this is another amendment related to the progressive movement. The 18th Amendment is the prohibition of alcohol. Why do I always have a hard time? Alcohol. And we could say, two things about it. One is that this is, clearly women's influence in politics, even before the 19th Amendment, women were very much active in reform movements, and one of those reforms was prohibition. The second thing, which becomes even more clear in the 1920s, is that the 1920s shows the difficulty in enforcing prohibition. And in fact, prohibition as a constitutional amendment does have its time limited. Passed in 1920, it gets repealed in 1933. And so, we might think about the progressive era as being a time period where like the idea of prohibition was really nice, but the 1920s is more of a time period of, okay, now how do we enforce this? And that was a lot more difficult. One of the things that politically active women advocated for following the 19th Amendment was called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. And you had political organizations like the National Woman's Party, which again sought to mobilize, coordinate, and organize women in a politically active way. The Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, it is a proposed amendment to the Constitution, so like the 19th and 18th Amendment. And what the ERA advocated for, or what it said essentially, was a constitutional amendment that would eliminate legal distinctions on account of sex. So would enshrine in the Constitution an amendment that would no longer make any distinctions based off of sex, male and female. So the ERA was defeated, so it did not pass during the 1920s, but once again does provide us with a cause, um, a cause in which we can see women being politically active post 19th Amendment, post women's suffrage. Now, the last Republican president of the 1930s is Herbert Hoover, who is probably most known as the last of these sort of hands-off Republican presidents. He was a candidate at the time who had really been kind of well liked and a popular figure. His presidency, though, ends up being really, really one of the worst presidencies that one could have. Um, Again, before the stock market crash of 1929, Hoover seemed as if he had all the qualifications and all the charisma that was needed to be a great president. But he is one of those people that suffers from being in the wrong place at the wrong time and saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. So we'll say about Herbert Hoover, he is the last of the quote unquote hands off Republican presidents. And he is president at the start of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is the worst economic time period in American history. We typically use the year 1929 as like not necessarily the beginning of the Depression, but that's certainly when things started to get worse. And because Hoover was captain of the ship when the ship was going down, he caught a lot of the blame for the Depression. And, it wasn't just a matter of failed policy, but it was a matter of failed PR, public relations, or optics. So, for example, we got a quote here from Hoover right on the eve of the worst economic depression in human history. And it says, quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Herbert Hoover in 1928, 1 year before the severe economic downturn of 1929. All right, section 3, culture of consumption. So, like we mentioned last section, you can't talk about the 1920s in the United States without talking about the rise in consumerism. Rising consumerism is just the increase in material purchases, so people buying stuff in the 1920s. And this very much is a sign of economic prosperity. So we just ridiculed Hoover last section for saying that the United States was on the verge of abolishing poverty. Well, in the 1920s, there were some reasons to be optimistic about that. It just so happened to be, 1 year later, the United States would descend into Great Depression. But we generally want to think about the 1920s as a very, very economically prosperous period. And there's a lot of different ways that we can track this rising consumerism. So we'll just go ahead and list four things here. One is in the different types of marketing strategies, marketing strategies. And this could just be like an increase in advertising. So, for example, we see this image here of a 1920s advertisement. And advertising, although we consider it to be primarily just like an inconvenience today, advertisements are actually a good sign for society because it shows that there's a surplus of goods. When there are so many things to go around, it means that businesses have to be a lot more creative and spend a lot more money to try and get you to buy their product. So, the rise in advertising, the new creative marketing strategies. So, for example, stores might like offer refreshments to try and get you into a store to buy something. An increase in all of these types of things during the 1920s shows that Americans were buying more and more was available to buy. The second thing was the rise of department stores. And department stores were pretty much a store where you could buy almost anything just under one roof. And what department stores wanted to do, or what they sought to do, was to make shopping, kind of like an experience, right? It wasn't just about going and purchasing the goods that you might need to survive or the goods that you might want, but to make shopping almost fun, to make it an event. So, for example, department stores could have things like daycares, they could have restaurants. uh, and so this created an atmosphere in which people would, go to shop essentially, but they were there to have an experience or, to like kind of have fun. Another way in which consumption changed, and this was true in the past, but mail order catalogs. This was a way for people to purchase goods over long distances, especially in the West. Again, the popularity of mail order catalogs just shows Americans consuming more. And the last thing is the availability of credit and installment plans. And these were things that definitely increased over the decade of the 1920s. And if you're not familiar, credit or like a credit card or an installment plan, this is essentially buy now, pay later. So even if you don't have the money, you could buy it on credit, get the thing now, enjoy the thing, whatever that is, and then worry about paying it back later. And so this put consumer goods or put goods in consumers' hands faster and got them, or they got the benefit of enjoying those products. Now there were all sorts of consumer items that Americans could buy in this time period. Let's just go ahead and put a statistic here. It said by 1927, this will just support the previous point. 60% of goods were purchased on credit, right? So when we think about this economic prosperity, yeah, we can point to, okay, how many cars do you own? How many, appliances? How many articles of clothing? And all those things were increasing quite significantly. But a lot of that was also paid for by credit, meaning that Americans couldn't afford it right then. They were anticipating that they could pay it off in the future, but got to reap all the benefits at that time. Now, like I was mentioning, out of all the consumer goods that were available for Americans, there is probably one that is the most significant, and that is the automobile, aka the car. Now, the automobile and the car, this transformed the American landscape. And we'll say about the automobile, maybe the most significant consumer good of the 1920s. And we'll talk a little bit in the next section about what the impact of the car had on broader American society. But just to give you an idea of how significant car ownership increased during the 1920s, is that by, and again, another statistic, see what we got, 1920, 1930, Americans owned more cars than Germany, Great Britain, France, Italy combined. All right, so add up all the cars in Germany, all the cars in Great Britain, all the cars in France, all the cars in Italy, and Americans owned more automobiles. Now, there is another reason very specific to why the automobile was so widely owned in the United States. Of course, everything that we said about the growing prosperity of the economy, the rise of consumerism, the abundance of credit, installment plans, all of these things do hold true. But specifically to the automobile, there was a technological innovation when it came to the production of cars, and that was Henry Ford's assembly line and the mass production of the Model T. So the Model T is just a type of car. We'll say that was widely purchased in the 1920s. But what Henry Ford's assembly line did was to make the process of making a car much more efficient and much more cheaper. Henry Ford did not invent the car, right? So cars had already been invented, but cars up until this point were luxury items. They were like yachts. A lot of common everyday people didn't own them. Henry Ford invented a way of making a car a lot cheaper, right? That's what his contribution was, and that's what the assembly line was. So this was a better way to make cars for a much cheaper price. And because Henry Ford was making Model Ts with this much more efficient way of production, Americans could afford cars. And so we say, Ford sometimes said of him, democratized, right? And to democratize something means make it available to the everyday person. He democratized the automobile so that by the end of the 1920s, 80% of all the cars on planet Earth were in the United States of America. Section 4, culture of escape. So, along with the economic progress of the 1920s was also technological progress. And with more free time, Americans engaged in culture and leisure at rates much, much higher than the past. So we're introduced here with a quote. It says, quote, "We wish to escape the restrictions of man-made laws and the inhibitions that society has placed upon us." Edgar Burroughs in the 19th. In some sense, the 1920s is one of the first decades in which there is a kind of celebrity culture. It's the popularity of movies, it's the abundance of the radio, it's new ways of cultural diffusion, right? Especially between movies and radio. We'll start off though with the impact of the car, and that is to say that the impact of the car went far beyond just the sort of shaping the social landscape or defining the economics of the era. It was also more cultural. So, for example, we can look at things like the economic impact. And the economic impact is, well, it led to a lot of prosperity. It led to a lot of increase in terms of the car industries, but it also affected other industries that were related to the automobile. So, the gas industry to fill up your car with fuel, glass, road construction, The car or the automobile industry became a major, major sector of the economy, maybe the biggest sector of the economy. One we might point to is like the geography, and that was cities became more spread out. Sometimes this is referred to as urban sprawl. So before, you could get from one place to another relatively efficiently via the train or via a subway or via a trolley, but you were very restricted in terms of where you could go, right? You could only go where the train took you. The impact of the automobile and road construction pretty much made it so that cities could spread out everywhere in all directions, and that's exactly what happened. So, for example, something like vacation became much more important because of the car. And then there's also culture. The car in a lot of ways meant freedom. And this could be in the form of, freedom from family, especially freedom for women, and freedom for couples. The idea of being able to just to jump in a car and go any place at any time, especially as far as, even something like dating rituals and courtship went. I mean, even the way that men and women or the way that people dated each other and courted one another changed. Before it was a lot more, the parents were a lot more involved, right? That you might have two young individuals that were interested romantically, but they would have to spend a lot of time with each other's parents or at each other's houses. Here with the automobile, two young lovers could just get in the car and pretty much go anywhere, any place. And again, that could be a lot of freedom, right? Whatever sort of form one took. So it's interesting to think about the impact of the car. It's economic, it's geographical, it's cultural. It ends up being a pretty important change as far as American society goes. Now, in terms of culture, there is a rising medium of culture, and that is film. And film will become probably one of the most significant American exports across the world. Film, we mean movies, were just say growing in popularity and importance. Hollywood, California became the movie capital of the world. And it wasn't just Americans who were enjoying these films. I mean, they were going globally. And they became, major, investments. You had these massive industries like Warner Brothers and Paramount and MGM, and they put a lot of money into the filmmaking industry. And it became, again, by the 1930s, probably the most powerful medium as far as popular culture went, replacing earlier mediums like literature and newspaper. They used to have these traveling shows, if you recall, called the vaudeville shows that were like traveling circuses. And maybe the only thing that could really compete with the movies was the radio, which was also somewhat of a newer technology. Specifically, the Jazz Singer in 1927. This was the first movie with sound. Before that, silent films were very popular. They might have sort of a piano soundtrack that was being played, but this was the first film that had sound. And of course, the movie industry just accelerated from this point onwards and became very popular. Now, the radio, we'd mentioned this earlier. We might say next to the car, transformed the country. So if the car was the most important consumer good that Americans bought that changed the country the most, the radio was right behind it. And the radio would have been right next to the car in terms of like those types of consumer items that led to this increased standard of living. Radios had much of the same impact that the car did. It had a whole economic impact in terms of like electrical industry, the steel industry. You needed to build radio towers for the radios to work. So there's a lot of economics going on. But also with the radio, it had the effect of, we might just say, the radio created a more broad national culture. Now you could have people in different parts of the country all listening to the same radio programs, all listening to the same advertisements. So it kind of created almost a sense of unity, right? Broad national culture would say a greater sense of unity. And, that's, you know, uh, it wasn't all that long ago that we were talking about the American Civil War and how the country was divided between North and South. A lot of those sectional differences, a lot of those sectional rivalries are are becoming much weaker thanks to something like the radio. Now, perhaps of all cultural contributions during the 1920s, none are probably more noticeable than the emergence and popularity of jazz music. In fact, so much so that in some textbook you'll see the 1920s be described as the jazz age. And along with movies, jazz is often cited as being one of America's greatest inventions. And, there's a lot of other kind of cultural trends in the 1920s that jazz music fits into, especially in some of the things we'll talk about in the upcoming sections. But we'll say just about jazz, this is music popularized by African Americans in the South. And it was brought to Northern white and black and global audiences. Being a kind of style of music originating from the South, from the rural parts of the country, from African American communities, eventually making its way into urban cities in the North, with audiences that contain both white and black consumers. The jazz age or jazz music was incredibly popular. The roots of jazz music, specifically the African American roots of the style of music, is illustrated here by William Dixon, who was a musician in Harlem, New York. He says, quote, about jazz music, it did seem to a little boy that white people really owned everything, but that wasn't entirely true. They didn't own the music that I played. And again, this was a style of music that was not just popular here in the US, but really did get exported to global audiences. And in a lot of ways, did change or challenge some of the kind of, racial prejudices and racial stereotypes that people had across the world. Another kind of important or another important growing cultural phenomenon is the phenomenon of sports. Might just say that sports, we'll just say, became more quote unquote professionalized. And what we mean by that is that you had individuals who can make a living off of those sports. And this is an evolution that had started from the Gilded Age, just up until this period. But many of the people who were participating in sporting events became more, I don't even think this is a word, but like celebritized, right? They became celebrities. The combination of celebrity sports stars providing advertisements for certain products. I mean, a lot of the sort of modern superstardom related to sports uh, was found in the 1920s. So, for example, people like Jack Dempsey, he was a famous boxer, and of course, the great Bambino, Babe Ruth, again, became more than just a sports figure. I mean, he became a celebrity and a celebrity known around the world. See an image of Babe Ruth here. But by far, the most recognizable quote unquote celebrity of the 1920s was Charles Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, we might say the most famous person in the 1920s, and he was not actor, he was not a sports star. What Charles Lindbergh did was he flew solo from, from New York, Paris, being the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Section 5, the new woman. So we mentioned at the top of this chapter that World War I had a significant impact on making Americans question kind of preconceived notions, right? There was an idea that, not just for Americans, but really the world, that we had it all figured out. But then something as horrible as the war happened, and then Americans began to question those long-standing assumptions. And among those assumptions were issues related to, or thoughts or beliefs or stereotypes related to gender. So before World War I, there was the idea of feminine and the idea of masculine. And the war, in a lot of ways, disproved a lot of those earlier notions. So, for example, during World War I, a lot of women participated in the war, working in the war industries. They left homes, went into the factories, and because of that, got the right to vote. So, this idea of what it meant to be feminine, that had been fundamentally challenged. Even on the flip side, in terms of being masculine, masculine was to be physically strong and brave and show courage and fight for your country. Well, World War I was so devastating that oftentimes the most brave soldiers were the ones that died first. Men were not just killed in the war, but they were physically harmed. And so many men came back from the war with physical injuries that really prevented them from fulfilling their traditional masculine roles or responsibilities. And so after World War I, there was much more of a questioning or challenging a lot of these earlier notions, or even just earlier notions of morality. And so, one way we find that this influences the 1920s in the United States is with new ideas related to gender. This section is called The New Woman, and the New Woman kind of refers to this new morality. Now, the symbol of the New Woman was the flapper, and the flapper is what you see depicted here. In this image, this is Louise Brooks in 1923. We also have an image here of the flapper. And this was a break from the conventional style of fashion and behavior and hairstyle of the past. So the flapper will say this is a symbol of the new woman. And just some things that mark the flapper as being different than her counterpart in the past is shorter hair, a short straight dresses, we'll say short straight clothing, less clothing, more revealing clothing, makeup, but also things like cigarettes, which were to be smoking a cigarette was considered to be a masculine behavior before, but for the flappers, this was a type of behavior that was more acceptable. Drinking alcohol, for example, was another thing, and just more carefree attitudes. Right, just not as concerned as one was before. So a lot of these different types of behaviors and stereotypes are illustrated in magazines, in the movies, and there was a certain degree of challenging a lot of these other preconceived stereotypes. However, there were limits, and probably the most significant limit that your textbook provides for kind of the new ideas related to acceptable feminine behavior was in the workplace. And we just might just say that women did not see stereotypes, or say gender stereotypes challenged in the workplace. In fact, the class of women who participated the most in the workplace were the lower class, and they did so out of necessity, not because there was any there was any challenging to this notion of private and public, right? Which you saw, which was more prevalent among middle and class. Now, again, the flapper, we usually just sometimes the flapper and the new woman are used interchangeably. So try not to get too confused over that. But the flapper kind of specifically refers to like an image, right? The short hair, the straight clothing, the makeup, the drinking. The new woman refers more to kind of the new morality around what was acceptable for men and women. So we might say the new morality around acceptable behavior for women in US society. And this was something that was more prevalent in urban areas. You might say an increase in co-ed spaces, right? Not as significant. More sexual freedom, premarital sex, for example. And more, what we'll say, same-sex relations. Again, all these things capture or encapsulate sort of these new ideas after World War One in the 1920s. And again, this is linked to other things like, for example, um, the drinking is linked to the failure of prohibition. The notion of being active in urban areas, a lot of this is associated with jazz music. So and consumerism, right? Too. So we kind of see the way in which a lot of these trends intersect in this decade. Section 6, the new Negro. So the 1920s also marks a decade where the approach to civil rights changes. And once again, we could point to some of the impacts of the post World War One world and what impact that ends up having on civil rights. So let us recall that it was because World War One, and we mentioned this last chapter, it was because of World War One that millions of African Americans could move out of the South because of the job opportunities in the North and relocate. This is referred to the Great Migration, right? This is the migration of millions of African Americans out of the South into the North. And a major catalyst for that was because of all the jobs that were provided by the war. However, though, when the war ended, along with a lot of other workers, a lot of those jobs were no longer needed. And so a lot of people were fired. Because of this, there was a lot more competition for jobs. And we find in the United States that there was a huge increase in racial tension. In fact, some of the worst racial riots in American history occur in this post World War One period. In an earlier section, we talked about the Red Summer of 1919. In this chapter, we're introduced to the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot of 1901, and this was part, although it happened in 1921, 2 years after the Red Summer, but we can consider the what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 as part of the racial violence of the Red Summer of 19. There was a significant African American population in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Booker T. Washington called it the Black Wall Street. And Black Wall Street was destroyed by white mobs. In total, again, the exact number are not isn't known, but perhaps up to 300 people were killed and 1,000 homes destroyed. in this violence. So when we think about the way in which the approach to civil rights changes, we should keep in mind incidents like the Red Summer, like the Tulsa riots of 1921, the changing patterns of migration, right? Now talking about African American communities in North and how that is related back to World War I. So, as a consequence of this, there was a cultural outpouring that occurred in Harlem, New York, known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, we'll call this a cultural outpouring of African American culture. And Harlem, New York was one of those cities in the North that grew significantly in terms of the African American population during the 1920s, or even earlier because of the Great Migration. A cultural outpouring of African American, say, poems, literature, artwork. There are several authors and poets and artists of the Harlem Renaissance, but probably the most famous ones or the most recognizable ones is first one is Langston Hughes. Yes, and Claude McKay. And a lot of the cultural works from the Harlem Renaissance, there were a couple of things going on, right? So, certainly the experience of the Red Summer was influencing some of this artwork. It was also the fact that World War I was supposedly the war to make the world safe for democracy. Yet the types of laws at home that restricted African American political rights, it was clearly evident that there was no democracy at home in the United States. And we're moving into a generation in the 1920s that did not experience slavery firsthand like an earlier generation did. And this was a generation of African Americans that were born into segregation, born into Jim Crow, born into lynching. And they were much less willing to tolerate that status quo, as opposed to maybe their parents and grandparents that had gone through the social and legal transformation of emancipation. So there's a sense of the Harlem Renaissance and civil rights more broadly as being more confrontational. And this new attitude towards civil rights is encapsulated in this phrase, quote unquote, the new Negro. This was a 1925 collection of literature and poetry. And we're going to say it represented a newer, more confrontational approach to civil rights, right? To battling Jim Crow, to making pleas to the federal governments about lynchings in the South. So it was a change in tone, we might say, in some sense, right? Much more confrontational. We have a quote here from Elaine Locke, who is another famous poet or author of the day. He says, quote, "We are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation." Now, many of these new ideas and kind of new approaches to the question of civil rights coalesced around one single figure, and that was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey provides us with a signal or a sign of kind of some of the newer and changing attitudes of the era, but also demonstrates a departure from earlier advocates of civil rights. Recall earlier that we had mentioned people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And Du Bois and Washington, in a lot of ways, were kind of the leading voices when it came to civil rights immediately following the Civil War. Marcus Garvey almost provides like a third approach in some ways. Garvey, who you see pictured here, we'll call him a Jamaican, so he's not actually from the United States, but he's a Jamaican, I spelled Jamaican publisher. who advocated for Pan-Africanism. And that's not to say others didn't. I believe Du Bois was also an advocate for Pan-Africanism, but his organization, the UNIA, which stood for the Universal Improvement Association, they did things like publish newspapers, hold parades, oftentimes wear military uniforms, right? If anything else, just the style of fashion of wearing a military uniform was part of it, and criticized the NAACP, which was Du Bois's organization. And the NAACP was a civil rights organization that was founded in the Gilded Age in an earlier time. And they were busy trying to fight for civil rights for African Americans, right? Change the legal system, get rid of Jim Crow. Booker T. Washington, if you'll recall, excuse me, he was focused much more on the economic part of it, right? Obtain an education and obtain wealth, and that's a way to political and social equality. Well, if Garvey doesn't want social and political equality and Garvey doesn't want economic equality, then what does Garvey want? What is he advocating? And essentially, what he is advocating is to just leave the United States entirely, that the United States is too prejudiced and too discriminatory, that it's not even worth sticking around to fight or challenge a lot of these disparities and discriminations. So Garvey helped to establish the Black Star Line. This was a shipping service from Africa to the Caribbean to the United States. And it encouraged a Back to Africa movement, right? That unlike Du Bois and unlike Washington, Marcus Garvey would say, look, the United States is just far too racist beyond redemption. It's not even worth sticking around. And instead, African Americans in the United States should just give up on the project entirely, return to the mother country or the homeland in Africa, and look to rebuild society there. Marcus Garvey advocated Pan-Africanism, and this was the idea to unite Africans around the world. So the fact that Garvey was not, he was in the Caribbean really didn't matter because he viewed the experience and national identity of Africans, whether they're African American or African back in the African continent or in Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Brazilian or whatever it was, that they had similar experiences in the way of facing discriminations that they ought to unite under one banner. And we can see this attitude reflected in this quote here that we have from Marcus Garvey, which is a really good quote, especially to put Garvey in a position against some of his other contemporaries like Washington and Boyce. So Garvey says, quote, for the Negro to depend on the ballot, and the ballot, this would have been something that Du Bois was advocating for, right? African Americans to have the right to vote and industrial progress. That's what Washington advocated, right? Economic and educational progress. He says, for the Negro to depend on the ballot and industrial progress alone will be hopeless, as it does not help him when he is lynched, burned, Jim Crowed, and segregated. Marcus Garvey. All right, last couple of sections here, 7, 8, and 9. Just a few brief things we're going to say about each one of these. So section 7 is called Culture War. Here we look at some of the impact that not just immigration had on the United States, but specifically the new ideas coming out of Europe. Recall the impact of the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the success of communism. Again, if we're trying to find a common thread through the 1920s of these types of impacts, the Russian Revolution was a consequence of World War I. And so some of the anxiety about new ideas entering into the United States, especially as it pertains to political radicalism, we do see that reflected in several ways. I believe this was mentioned in an earlier chapter, but it's mentioned here again. So we'll go ahead and say it, and that is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Um, this was a trial that we might say is evidence for U.S., say, paranoia about immigration and radical ideas. Sacco and Vanzetti, these were two Italian, I will also call them radical. And by radical, we mean like involved with ideas related to anarchism or communism, anti-capitalist, anti-democratic, right? So ideas that were perceived as being dangerous. These were two Italian radicals executed for murder on what many historians would consider weak evidence. So the question is, well, if the evidence was so weak, then why were these two people convicted of murder and executed? Well, again, we want to kind of use this fear of immigrants. They were immigrants, fear of radical ideas. We might also associate this with the Red Scare, the fear of communism at home. And so all those themes are overlapping with this one. As far as immigration goes, we get some pretty significant changes as far as immigration. You know, if you're tracking American history, the 1920s does mark a significant turning point in immigration policies. And that is when the United States enacts some of the most restrictive immigration measures, specifically the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924. I mean, both these laws essentially do the same thing. Essentially, they restrict, or we say laws that restrict immigration based on national origin, according to the 1890 census. So pretty much what that meant was the United States had created an immigration policy that looked back to the year 1890, got a feel for the ethnic makeup of the country, and then based it off that. So for example, if the 1890 census, and the census is where the country tallies or tracks the population, let's say that from Italy, only 5% of people in the United States were Italian. Well, now in the 1924 immigration, only 5% of immigrants could be Italian, right? So it's to use the census from, what is that, 35 years ago to base immigration restrictions on. And the impact that that had was that it affected the new immigrants the most, right? The new immigrants, these are Southern and Eastern Europe. And they were the most impacted by immigration laws. Just sort of as an aside, please also recall from an earlier chapter, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that led to, or they added on to that law, which more or less just banned all immigration from Asia. So the groups of people that were affected the most, any groups from Asia, I mean, Asian immigration is just practically cut off. Southern immigrations, or Southern Europe, excuse me, that would be like Italy, and Eastern Europe, which would be Russia, and a lot of Eastern European Jews who had came during the Gilded Age because of that. Now, during the 1890 census, well, if you look at groups like the Irish, well, the Irish were a big part of the country. And so 30% of all immigrants could be from Ireland. But the reality was is that by that point, there weren't that many Irish immigrants anymore. So certain countries were favored by this law. Ireland, Germany, England, a lot of those people could continue moving to the United States because there were already a lot of those people there in the 1890s. But other groups that have been just arriving recently, like immigrants from Asia, immigrants from Southern Europe, immigrants from Eastern Europe, those are the ones that are pretty significantly restricted. And these laws, they more or less stay in effect until 1965. So we want to think of the period from really 1920 to 1965 as being a period of not really that much immigration in the United States. Here in section 8, fundamentalist Christianity. And fundamentalism, or the fundamentals, as we might put it, is simply just a literal belief in the Bible or in Christian faith. So we might just say that fundamentalism is a literal belief. We'll just say in the Bible or in Scripture. You can be a lot of different, fundamentalism comes in a lot of different religions. You can be a Christian fundamentalist, which is what we're talking about here, Islamic fundamentalist, Jewish fundamentalist. To be a fundamentalist just means that you believe in, literally the scripture. And there were a lot of reasons as to why fundamentalism was increasing in popularity during the 1920s. This is a decade where the country is changing pretty significantly, and it's not just from the First World War. That's part of it, but it's from some of these other trends. So, for example, the increase in Catholicism, and this might give, especially Protestants in the country, a reason to hesitate. Right? This is related to immigration, or at least some of it is, right? There are more immigrants that are coming from nations, and that was going on all during the Gilded Age. Greater sexual freedom. Think about the new morality from the new woman, right? Especially in urban areas. Rise in leisure, right? Movies, sporting events. It's good to have fun, but maybe not at the expense of other moral virtues or other moral values. And the prohibition, or maybe more importantly, not just prohibition, but the failure of prohibition. In fact, the part of the country was most interested in getting rid of alcohol was the more fundamentalist religious part of the country, the rural part of the country, believing that alcohol was a sin and that it was harming society. The failure of prohibition during the 1920s was a blow to those who had advocated for it. So a lot of the changes in culture and some of these other trends kind of, it makes us better understand why there was a religious pushback against some of these things. For the fundamentalists in the country, a lot of these things were challenging their notions of morality, their notions of what the country should be, what the country is, et cetera, et cetera. And the catalyst for this clash between a resurgent Christian fundamentalist, ethos and the changing, urbanizing, modernizing world was the Scopes trial of 1905. This was a highly publicized trial over teaching evolution in the classroom. And this served as a perfect catalyst of these two worlds, right? The rural, religious, fundamentalist world, and the urban, the modern, the changing sensibilities. And because of the power of the radio, Americans could tune into this trial, and everybody had more or less an opinion about it. It was called, there were different names for it. It was called the monkey trial, of course, because of the theory of evolution versus creationism. It was called the trial of the century. But it served as a perfect point or a perfect point of contention of kind of the way that the United States was changing, right? It was changing from a rural conservative or rural fundamentalist nation to a more urban and more modern nation. The last thing that we'll mention here in the chapter about the 1920s is the rebirth of the Klan, or the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. And of all the trends of the 1920s, from the flapper to the Harlem Renaissance to the emergence of jazz, we typically don't associate the 1920s with the emergence or reemergence of the Klan, but it is the decade, in fact, in which the Ku Klux Klan experiences its highest popularity. And there are, a couple of factors that are contributing to this. Part of it is a backlash against immigration. Part of it is backlash against the Great Migration, so African Americans arriving in northern cities. Part of it is the popularity of a specific film called The Birth of a Nation. This was a popular film that portrayed Klan as the quote unquote good guys. So it was a film in which the Klan was portrayed as the protagonist, right? The heroes of the film. And it, in some ways, served as a recruiting tool. People go out, they see this movie, they see the Klan acting very heroically, very valiantly, not historically accurate. But they decide that they want to join the Klan, and they do so for this reason. Now, the Klan that emerged in the 1920s was different than the Klan during Reconstruction. Again, recall that during Reconstruction, in an earlier chapter, 1865 to 1877, this was the quote unquote first Klan. The Klan itself had originated as a fraternity for Confederate soldiers, but then when Reconstruction came, it turned itself into a terror slash guerrilla slash political organization to roll back all the rights that African Americans gained. And they did battle with Union armies during Reconstruction. It was bloody. They used terror and murder and arson and every single, measure that they could. But the Klan of the Reconstruction era, this was a Klan that was specifically targeting African Americans. It was specifically in the South. And for the most part, it was dealt with by the Union Army. The second Klan is a little bit different. It is not just anti-African American like the old Klan. It is also anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anything that is not what they would call white Anglo or Protestant. It is anti-feminist and anti-bootleggers. A bootlegger is someone who illegally transports alcohol. So they would have been upholding prohibition. They still resort to violence and terror, but they are more, we might say, politically active. They're more in the business of getting candidates, doing fundraisers. They're more mainstream. They are more northern, right? This is a Klan that is not just in the South, right? The old Klan was the Klan of the South. There are Klan chapters in northern cities and even Klan chapters as far north as Canada. And in fact, that's their time of most popularity.